Inside a sealed plastic membrane, a microscopic lattice of potassium and nitrate ions waits in total darkness. A human hand applies sudden physical pressure to the exterior of the pouch. An inner barrier ruptures. Water floods the crystalline lattice. In a fraction of a second, trillions of molecular bonds snap. To break apart, these ionic bonds require kinetic energy, and they ruthlessly strip that energy from the ambient heat of the surrounding water. The temperature of the fluid plummets rapidly, crossing the threshold toward freezing. You hold this chemical void against a sprained wrist and call it an instant cold pack. You assume it is a minor, modern medical convenience. You are mistaken. You are holding the chained ghost of a thermodynamic weapon that once emptied a royal palace. The year is 1620. The location is the Great Hall of Westminster Abbey. At this moment in history, it is the single largest enclosed volume of space in the British Isles, stretching more than 300 feet from end to end. The vaulted stone ceiling disappears into heavy shadows far overhead. It is the height of a London summer. The heat outside is not a blistering desert exposure, but inside this cavernous stone envelope, packed tightly with the radiant heat of hundreds of human bodies, burning tallow candles, and completely stagnant air, the atmospheric pressure is suffocating. It is a dense, inescapable blanket of humidity. Into this thermal trap steps Cornelius Drebbel. He is a Dutch inventor, entirely self-taught, occupying a strange historical space between a mechanical engineer and an illusionist. King James I keeps him at court as an aristocratic novelty. Drebbel has previously engineered artificial thunder, mechanical automatons, and self-regulating clocks. But on this specific July afternoon, he has promised the king a physical impossibility. He has promised to manipulate the localized climate. He has promised to manifest the dead of winter indoors, precisely on command. He delivers. Through physical mechanisms he absolutely refused to document, Drebbel plunged the ambient temperature of that massive hall so aggressively that King James, surrounded by the elite of British society, began to physically shudder. The drop in thermal energy was not subtle. It was a violent physiological shock. The historical records are entirely unanimous regarding the physical reaction. The King of England stood up and fled. He abandoned his own great hall and walked back out into the sweltering heat of the London afternoon because the oppressive summer sun was vastly preferable to the unnatural, biting cold that Drebbel had engineered inside. Hold that sequence of events in your mind. 4 entire centuries ago, long before the invention of mechanical compression, before the electric motor, before the field of thermodynamics even possessed the vocabulary to articulate what was happening, one man stripped the heat out of the largest room in England. He did it so violently that the absolute sovereign of the nation ran from it. Architectural historians and thermodynamic engineers, analyzing the archival accounts of that afternoon, categorized Drebbel's unseen apparatus as the first functional air conditioner. It is the direct biological ancestor of the metal box humming violently in your window right now. But he achieved this without a single watt of power. There was no engine running in Westminster Abbey. There was nothing burning. There was no rotational energy. The apparatus drew its freezing temperatures from an entirely different physical domain. It relied on a quiet, invisible structural collapse happening inside vats of water. And while Drebbel intentionally took the exact schematics of his machinery to the grave, he left chemical fingerprints all over the historical record. We know the molecular compounds he had access to. We possess the diaries of the aristocrats who observed him. And we know exactly which mineral, when subjected to rapid aqueous dissolution, will violently drag the thermal energy out of the air. It was not a parlor trick. It was a terrestrial material. Within a single century, this exact white salt would become one of the most aggressively contested resources on the surface of the planet. But it would not be fought over for its ability to regulate the climate of a room. To understand the gravity of what Drebbel actually achieved in that hall, we must examine the crystalline structure at the very center of his machine. The mineral is potassium nitrate. Historically, it is known as saltpeter. If you have encountered the term at all, it is likely buried under archaic military folklore and barracks rumors. Strip away the mythology. What remains is a stark chemical compound. It is a white, heavily textured crystal that, for the vast majority of human civilization, was painstakingly scraped from the damp floors of limestone caves, the rotting walls of horse stables, and the nitrogen-rich soil beneath ancient villages. To the naked eye, it mimics the appearance of coarse table salt. You could hold a handful of it in the morning light and assume it possessed no inherent value. It is not a passive stone. When you introduce an ordinary sodium chloride salt into water, the liquid either maintains its baseline temperature or warms by a nearly imperceptible margin. Introduce saltpeter, and the physics invert entirely. The water chills. It does not cool gradually, it drops measurably and rapidly. Deposit a sufficient volume of potassium nitrate into a reservoir, and you force the temperature of the fluid down toward the low 30s Fahrenheit. This phenomenon requires no power grid, no moving parts, and no synthetic refrigerants. It operates on fundamental molecular mechanics. A saltpeter crystal is a rigid lattice held together by powerful ionic bonds. To shatter that structure and force the crystal to dissolve, kinetic energy is strictly required. That energy cannot be magically generated. It must be violently extracted from the immediate environment. It comes directly from the H2O molecules. The dissolving crystal strips heat out of the surrounding water to fuel its own structural collapse. As that thermal energy is systematically drained, the water's temperature plummets. Chemists define this as an endothermic reaction. It is a process that consumes heat to survive. You have physically experienced this exact mechanism. The instant cold pack in your first aid kit, the plastic pouch you snap and crush for a swollen joint, is not a modern synthetic miracle. Inside that sealed envelope, a nitrate salt is violently introduced to a pocket of water. Within seconds, the entire mass goes numbingly cold against your skin. It is not an illusion. It is not a battery. It is the exact, brutal chemistry Drebbel manipulated 4 centuries ago, now commodified and sealed in plastic. The medical device in your bathroom cabinet is the direct thermodynamic descendant of the machinery that routed a king. Now, scale the geometry in your mind. 1 crushed packet numbs a wrist. Drebbel operated with massive wooden vats and industrial volumes of saltpeter. He multiplied the chemical reaction until it consumed the ambient heat of a royal cathedral. The underlying physics are identical. The only variable is volume. This forces a disturbing logical collision. If a handful of this mineral drops the temperature of a glass, and an engineered array of it chilled a 17th century palace, the physical laws dictate it could cool the room you are currently sitting in. The physics permit it. The historical record verifies it. The question is not whether this crystal can cool a modern home. The question is why it doesn't. Why, with 400 years of engineering advancement, is there not a single structure on Earth cooled by dissolution? The answer has absolutely nothing to do with thermodynamics. It has everything to do with empires. Before we examine what eradicated saltpeter cooling, we must establish the historical baseline. Drebbel was not a solitary magician. He was not the first to witness the cold. 6 decades before that freezing afternoon in London, Giambattista della Porta recorded the identical phenomenon. Della Porta was a Neapolitan polymath, an obsessive scholar of optics and agriculture. In 1558, he documented a profound thermal anomaly. Potassium nitrate, dissolved in water, plummeted the temperature of the fluid far below its natural baseline, chilling it to the brink of freezing. He was not theorizing. He was recording a reproducible, physical mechanism. You could place the materials on a wooden table, combine them, and watch the water ice over. Della Porta understood this white mineral possessed absolute authority over temperature. He published the mechanics. The knowledge spread like a contagion through the laboratories and aristocratic courts of Renaissance Europe. It became a weapon of extreme luxury. Wealthy hosts constructed saltpeter baths to dramatically chill wine in the dead of summer, manipulating temperatures the natural climate could never achieve. The physical mechanism was heavily documented. Men were already weaponizing the chemistry for parlor tricks. Drebbel's absolute genius in 1620 was not the discovery of the thermal drop. His genius was industrial scale. He took a tabletop curiosity and engineered a system massive enough to subjugate the atmosphere of the largest hall in England. We are not analyzing a fluke of history that died with a secretive inventor. We are staring at an infinitely repeatable law of physics that the most brilliant minds in Europe actively utilized for over a century. The cold was real. The technological pathway was wide open. Understand the gravity of this exact historical moment. humanity arrived at a genuine technological divergence. In the early 1600s, mechanical refrigeration did not exist. A functioning compressor would not be invented for another 130 years. During that massive void in human history, the absolute only mechanism on Earth to artificially generate deep, indoor cold on demand was this dissolving crystal. Think of what this necessitates. For over a century, this was not simply an alternative method for cooling. It was the only method. If human comfort was going to evolve, if architectural cooling was going to mature, if the modern conditioned home was going to exist, it had to grow from this specific chemical reaction. There was no other seed in the dirt. Picture the alternative reality. A timeline where the most aggressive engineers of the 17th and 18th centuries dedicate their lives to refining aqueous cooling. They make the mineral extraction cheaper. They engineer the reaction to be perfectly reversible. They integrate the vats directly into the masonry of ordinary homes. It is not science fiction. It is the most mathematically logical progression of the technology, because for over 100 years, it was the only technology available. That world never materialized. It did not stall because the physics failed. The physics never fail. It stalled because at the exact moment this crystal was poised to become the infrastructure of global comfort, humanity realized it possessed a secondary trait. A trait the world demanded with absolute desperation. To understand the death of the cold, you must dissect the anatomy of gunpowder. Black powder requires precisely 3 ingredients: charcoal, sulfur, saltpeter. By a massive margin, saltpeter dictates the mixture. Roughly 75% of the physical weight of every barrel of gunpowder is potassium nitrate. The identical white crystal that froze Drebbel's hull is the precise compound that detonates a musket. Without the nitrate, the charcoal and sulfur are completely inert dirt. Saltpeter is the engine of ballistic warfare. Let that thermodynamic collision anchor in your mind. The exact identical mineral that pulls the ambient temperature of a glass toward freezing is the compound that detonates a cannon. One structure of atoms, 2 violently opposed destinies. You can engineer human comfort, or you can engineer firepower. Humanity was forced to make a binary choice. It was never a competition. Observe the geopolitical reality of the 17th and 18th centuries. This was the precise window of time when endothermic cooling could have integrated into human architecture. But Europe was a theater of perpetual, grinding slaughter. Every sovereign nation was actively waging war, recovering from war, or financing the next war. And those wars ran exclusively on black powder. A military force quantified its right to exist in literal tons of potassium nitrate. If a kingdom exhausted its supply of saltpeter, it exhausted its ability to defend its own borders. The historian of technology Brenda Buchanan, analyzing the explosive logistics of the era, documented a brutal truth. Saltpeter was the 17th century equivalent of enriched uranium. Reread that comparison. It was not a minor agricultural commodity. It was the absolute heaviest strategic currency on Earth. If you are a monarch, and you possess a strictly finite reserve of the single most critical military compound in human existence, you do not permit your engineers to dissolve it into vats to make a dining hall pleasant. You guard every single grain. You execute anyone diverting it as a traitor to the crown. The cold was born into a timeline where the exact chemical it required to function was the most jealously guarded weaponized resource on the planet. Comfort cannot outbid conquest. The scarcity was absolute. For the majority of human history, potassium nitrate could not be mined in deep subterranean veins. It had to be scraped from the surface of the rotting earth. European monarchs deployed specialized government agents, saltpetermen who carried explicit legal authority to rip up the wooden floorboards of civilian barns and dovecotes to hunt for trace yields of the crystal in the animal. Waste. The process was filthy, excruciatingly slow, and yielded fractions of what was required. Under the reign of King Charles I, the entirety of England struggled to extract 300 tons in a single year. The demand for artillery fired faster than the earth could rot. Then, one empire bypassed the European dirt entirely. In the vast alluvial plains of Bengal and Bihar in India, potassium nitrate crystallized naturally and abundantly in the topsoil, replenished by the monsoons year after year. The indigenous population had harvested it for generations. In the 18th century, the British East India Company surveyed this geography and realized they were not looking at a mere trade route. They were looking at absolute global supremacy. Following the British military victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, they seized the territory. They seized the dirt. At the height of their occupation, the British Empire controlled roughly 70% of the total global production of saltpeter. 70% of the world's enriched uranium, locked inside a single imperial vault. They immediately banned its export. The British military apparatus understood that whoever controls the nitrate controls the explosions, and whoever controls the explosions dictates the borders of the world. They choked off every rival power on the continent. The French military explicitly blamed a severe deficit of saltpeter for their collapse in the 7 Years' War. The rebelling American colonists desperately scrambled for any trace of the crystal. Every ounce of potassium nitrate was stamped for artillery use only. This is the exact mathematical moment the cold died. At the precise decade when the most brilliant thermodynamic minds could have refined Drebbel's machinery into the walls of civilian homes, the raw material was classified as a weapon of mass destruction. You cannot build a global industry of domestic air conditioning on a substance that the dominant superpower has restricted for naval warfare. There was no grand conspiracy. There was no secret cabal of industrialists plotting to keep humanity sweating. It was just the cold, brutal arithmetic of state violence. The endothermic reaction did not fail. It was outbid by the cannon. Look at the catastrophic loss of human potential. We are a species that aggressively optimizes whatever mechanism we focus upon. We took raw combustion and confined it into the internal combustion engine. We captured raw electrical arcs and built a planetary grid. If 3 centuries of the most ruthless chemical engineers had focused on the dissolving crystal, they would have made the recovery process cheaper. They would have perfected the thermodynamic loop. They would have woven it into the masonry of our cities. But that intellectual capital was diverted. The mines and the materials went into the cannons. We took the crystal that could have cooled the earth, and we vaporized it by the megaton to blow holes in human bodies. So, if the war crystal was locked away, what engineered the cold we live in now? Thermodynamics took an entirely different, vastly more profitable path. In 1748, a Scottish physician named William Cullen placed diethyl ether in a vacuum and allowed it to rapidly boil. He demonstrated that the phase change of a liquid turning into a gas violently extracts heat from the surrounding environment. This is phase change compression. It relies on evaporation and mechanical pressure, entirely bypassing the need to dissolve a physical salt. It is the exact mechanical cycle screaming inside the metal box in your window right now. But this mechanical pathway possessed a critical trait that saltpeter cooling could never achieve. It could be owned. You cannot monopolize a bucket of water and a naturally occurring mineral. You cannot patent a 400-year-old law of physics. The mechanism is unowned. But a mechanical compressor? A sealed loop of copper coils? A synthesized, proprietary chemical refrigerant? You can patent every single component. In the 20th century, chemists synthesized chlorofluorocarbons freon for this exact purpose. The modern history of cooling is the history of proprietary machines pumping proprietary chemicals. Corporate entities manufactured the compressor, legally restricted the gas, sold you the unit, and billed you for the maintenance. They enclosed the cold. Let me be scientifically exact. Saltpeter cooling was never going to flawlessly replace mechanical compression. Even if the mineral was completely free, the chemical logistics are brutal. Once the lattice dissolves and the heat is absorbed, the reaction is spent. To reverse the process and recover the crystal, you must boil off massive vats of water, which requires an immense input of thermal energy. It was never going to adequately refrigerate a skyscraper. It was never going to regulate the thermal load of a modern server farm. But that is entirely irrelevant to the tragedy. The point is not that aqueous cooling was flawless. The point is that it was a functioning, low-power, deeply simple methodology that was abandoned for the wrong reasons. It was not discarded because of its scientific limitations. It was discarded because imperial militaries commandeered the mineral, and corporate monopolies demanded a mechanism they could meter. The cheap, universally accessible solution was quietly smothered by the highly profitable, proprietary one. The cold we inherited is simply the cold that could be controlled. Walk into your bathroom right now. Open the cabinet. Take out that plastic emergency cold pack and hold it in your hand. Feel the weight of the fluid and the rigid granules trapped inside. Snap the inner barrier. Let the microscopic lattice of potassium and nitrate flood with water. Feel the violent drop in thermal energy against your skin. You are not holding a medical convenience. You are holding the exiled ghost of an alternate civilization, a timeline where the simplest mechanism was allowed to survive before it was swallowed by the machinery of war and the architecture of profit.